And Nigeria's outgoing President Muhammadu Buhari has acknowledged there were some technical issues with last Saturday's election, but maintains that the electoral process was free and fair. He said the declared winner, Bola Tinubu, from the governing All Progressives Congress, was the best person for the job. In his victory address, Mr. Tinubu urges his rivals and the nation to unite amid escalating tension between the APC and the main opposition parties. He's accepted that there had been some lapses during voting, but insists there were few and far between and immaterial to the final outcome.
Absolutely. Well, the hotly contested election between the three main parties, of course, it still is. It's the closest it's been in years, but some say that the PDP and the APC failed to get the constitutional 25% requirement in the Federal Capital Territory and so cannot win the election. These comments have ignited a conversation and more controversy. Well, let's try and understand this. We're joined in the studio by Emmanuel Ogebe, who's an international human rights lawyer and something of an expert on Nigerian election law. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Is it, in your assessment, going to be up to the courts to decide the interpretation of that part of the Constitution that deals with the FCT with regard to elections, or is there enough there for it to be explained in just plain language and it doesn't have to end up in court?
Well, Charles, all elections in Nigeria tend to end up in the courts, and I've always said that there are two institutions that midwife elections in Nigeria, INEC and the courts. INEC basically creates the mess and the courts have to clean up after them. And so clearly this is going to go to the courts. Now, with regard to this specific provision, it is quite intriguing because in normal understanding of plain English, that requirement has not been met, which is that 25% of the FCT should also have been met in the threshold to qualify. And that hasn't happened in this case. However, in legal reasoning, sometimes you find that the language of the law is not the same language of the average man. And in this case, it has to be resolved by the court, either of two ways. Either by conjunctive reading of the text or disjunctive reading of the text. Reading it conjunctively would imply that Abuja is part of the 25 states plus Abuja. Reading it disjunctively means the states and Abuja.
Right.
Now, there are certain schools of thought in election law jurisprudence that say Abuja needs to be treated as a state. But the people of Abuja are like the people of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
They don't have statehood, and they're desiring statehood. So it would be unfair to them to be used and treated as a state only for electoral purposes when they literally do not benefit from the democracy that we have. For example, Abuja, the people in Abuja voted in this election, but next week they're not going to have elections because they don't have a governor and members of the House.
And indeed, because they've been clamoring for a special status or upgrade us to a state level. So you're right when you say when it comes to elections, we give special, we then pay attention to Abuja, but otherwise we disregard them. So it does mean that the interpretation will end up at the Supreme Court. We'll leave it for the courts to interpret. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's going to have to be a determination by the courts at this point. And I will tell you, personally, I wish that, Abuja should have 25% because it will give them a bit of a say in national affairs. And remember, Abuja is an artificial creation.
Yeah, but wouldn't that confer, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
I mean, confer exceptional status when the other states, you group them together into a block, and then you say, having won 2/3 of these states, let's take a look and you've got to win 25% here as well. I mean that gives it exceptional status, doesn't it?
But right now they have a disadvantaged status. So I think it almost evens things out a little if they have a preferred status. But let me say this about Abuja. Abuja is actually an artificial city. And it is probably, like Lagos, one of the most Nigerian cities.
Right.
Maybe even more than Lagos. Because they are Lagosians who believe they're indigenous and lay claim to it. But Abuja is all of us. So it almost is fair to have like a casting vote that makes everything okay. But I agree that it provides Abuja with enormous power. Something we shouldn't forget, though, is that this constitutional requirement is for the first election. And so if the first election doesn't meet that threshold and you have a runoff, that requirement is no longer
obviously we're talking
necessary.
about the first election, aren't
Yes. Yeah.
But when you describe, I mean, if we're to interpret this, obviously, those against it are not looking at the English interpretation of the phrase "and." But does it not mean that you must win the Federal Capital Territory to become the president of Nigeria, to give it that spread, that the Nigerian president is voted by all across a particular spread, including Abuja? Isn't that what this is saying? I mean, must win. Do you think so?
Well, here's the thing. Ironically, this issue has bedeviled Nigerian electoral jurisprudence for decades. In the 79 elections, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court what the definition of 2/3 was. And so the courts have created a formula, a mathematical formula, that actually explains how that ratio is met. So to you and I, to the average listener, you think that it means specifically that Abuja must have 25%. But with the formula that the courts have created, there's actually a numeric value that is attached. You add all the states together and come to a
That's a very good point, because I'm looking at a senior advocate of Nigeria has sent me that mathematical thing. He says, he titled it Maths 101. Says two-thirds of 36 states is 24. Two-thirds of 37 is 24.33. And that would not be admissible unless you see Abuja as the 33, the point 33.
Yes, and the concept and the reason, the rationale behind this is equity and fairness. And I would like to compare it with the situation in the US where I'm based, which is, this is Nigeria's equivalent of the Electoral College. Except that, in fairness to Nigeria, this is one situation where our own provision is fairer than in the US. The Electoral College in the US was supposed to provide southern slave-owning states with a little more leverage in determining who the president of the US was. And it's become anachronistic because you now have a split between who wins the popular vote and who wins the Electoral College, and sometimes it's not the same thing. So in Nigeria, it actually, I think, is a better model in Nigeria to have this requirement than the Electoral College in the US. And I think that this is a test case to really let us know whether Abuja is again going to be taken for granted. Because it is, I think, unfair to the people of Abuja not to have self-determination status. And I think it's only fair to them to at least be able to have a determination status in the presidency.
Yeah, but I think the really critical thing here, which is why this is just so interesting, but also so a little bit nebulous, I mean, is the fact that if you describe Nigeria, and that's, I mean, you understand the Constitution more than most of us. If you describe Nigeria and you don't specifically mention FCT, wouldn't you be leaving out a component part of Nigeria? That seems to be the only reason, according to some logic, why it's mentioned. You see what I mean? That's the reason why. So if the opposition go to court on this, it'll be good, I mean, obviously for a finer definition to be given, but if this is the only point they want to make, Is it likely to work or not?
Well, here's my response to that. All election cases in Nigeria tend to be litigated. And we have, except for the 2015 case where President Jonathan conceded. Now, here's the thing with regard to this particular election. I will give you my own personal example. I flew in from Washington to Nigeria to vote. And with the cash crunch and everything, I drove all the way to my home state to vote. I got there and the Bibers refused to accredit me, either with my fingerprints or with my eye scan. And so I already felt disenfranchised.
Right.
And I came all the way back to Abuja. You can imagine how I felt the next day when we saw that the results were not even uploaded for the people who actually got to vote. Now, I will say this, I voted in 2019, and I can tell you that literally all the people I know who traveled to vote in 2019 didn't travel to vote this time because they had no money. So what I'm saying is that a lot of people were disenfranchised because of the cash crunch. Now, is that justiciable for them? In other words, can they sue the government and say, hey, you denied us the opportunity because we had no money and we didn't have an input? Then when we link it to the issue of Abuja, the people lined up in Abuja, someone in my compound didn't get home till 11 p.m. Because he waited to vote. And if we cut out Abuja from determining the presidential election by saying, well, you know, you don't count, then we have disenfranchised them significantly. And like I said, already they have only one election day, which is the presidential election day. They don't have the governorship day.
Right.
So that's stealing, that's actually disempowering the people of Abuja more.
It does look like simple logic, but again, in Nigeria, we make everything look like rocket science. But I wanted to ask you, because you talked about elections and litigation, except for the 2015 election. So when it comes to Nigeria elections, the people decide first, then come the justices.
Yes.
Where does that leave the process? What's the relevance of the voting process?
Yes.
Where does that leave that?
Yes. This has been called by an American jurisprudentialist the tyranny of an oligarchy. When you have a court of 12 or a court of 9, as they have in the US, decide an election for, you know, hundreds of millions of people, it appears unjust. Now, as you know, elections in the US are generally not contested until we had Trump, who filed over 50 lawsuits claiming election fraud.
And lost most of
them. He lost
all of them.
And even his lawyers, you know, are facing disciplinary charges from the bar. Mayor Giuliani was fired suspended by the New York bar. So it's not something that happens often there. But in Nigeria, it comes with the territory. Today I was on the phone with the retired justice of the Supreme Court, and he laughed. He said, listen, this happens all the time in Nigeria. This is to be expected. Now, I want to clarify that judges, generally, appellate court judges, usually don't want to tamper with the decision of a lower court judge. And the rationale is this. The lower court judge takes evidence from witnesses, and so he has a first-hand grasp of the demeanor of the witnesses and so on and so forth. So before you overturn his findings, you have to be sure that he really erred in law. That same principle applies and is extended to election appeals. The justices actually take it very seriously and say, look, millions of Nigerians voted, and before we annul their votes, just this handful of us, let's be very sure that this reached an egregious level that would make for an overturn. Now, in 2007, there was a really horrendous election, and that case obviously went to court. And the judges had to look, and the standard is, was there substantial non-compliance? What was intriguing in that case is that one of the contestants, I won't name him, shot himself in the foot because he said I was excluded from the election. What had happened was the ballots were printed before the elections, and he was excluded. He went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said he should be added on. So they printed fresh ballots, and he went in last minute. And so he made two claims. One was that I was excluded, and secondly, my votes were not properly counted. And the court said you can't make two contradictory claims. If you are excluded, then you had no votes. But you are arguing that you were excluded and your votes were not properly counted, which means that you had votes and you were not excluded. And that's how he lost the petition. So the litigation is very technical, and it takes a lot of lawyering.
Right.
The second candidate in that election lost his petition, and you will not believe why. In their petition, they had two sets of complaints. One was criminal in nature, and one was civil in nature. And so, in law, you have two standards for criminal and civil. For the criminal, it has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. For the civil, it has to be proven on the balance of probabilities. And so that candidate, his lawyer went into court and said, you know what, I'm abandoning all my criminal allegations that we filed. And because of that, most of his case was gone. And the determination was on the civil allegations, which was on the balance of probabilities.
If I hear you correctly, are you saying it's impossible to upturn an election such as the presidential election in Nigeria because it would be difficult to prove? Because we have a situation on ground where the major opposition political parties boycotted the collation of results because they felt the election was a sham. And one of them, the Labour Party, today has said we are heading to the courts. But when I hear you speak, I mean, I'm not a legal person, but you seem to say it is almost impossible to upturn a presidential election in Nigeria.
Yeah, it's a difficult standard to meet, but again, with good lawyering, it can be met. The judges, again, have to be careful to toy with what is believed to be the expressed opinion of tens of millions of Nigerians.
But there's also got to be a very clear, very almost narrow interpretation of the law, isn't there? Because the opposition parties are saying very clearly that there is a fundamental violation of the law here. That this is what the law requires. You've got to upload this. There's specific things that need to be done. And if those conditions are shown to not have been met, then it would be extremely difficult. But you're a lawyer, so you know some of these things. I mean, there are also other circumstances that are taken into account, aren't there, by the justices?
Absolutely. Now, here's a quick illustration here. One of the fascinating things about this election is that Peter Obi is in this election. Now, Peter Obi, in his gubernatorial race, lost, and he challenged it in court and became the first governor in this dispensation to reclaim his mandate through a court.
Yes.
And so I imagine that given his legal industry and dexterity in overturning that election and getting the governorship, that he has a track record of being able to pull that off again now. And with regard to some of the complaints we've seen in these elections, clearly at this point it is so clear that there have been violations of the law, of the electoral law, and there have been violations of INEC's own guidelines. Now, of course, there are arguments on both sides. There are arguments of people who say that INEC guidelines are not law. But what the electoral law provides is that INEC must follow its own guidelines. And I can illustrate it this way. Some of the pre-election matters involve parties who lost primaries. And when they go to court, they say, hey, our party has its own constitution, and its guidelines for this process in the primaries, and they were not followed. And the courts pay attention to that.
Right.
So you cannot come around and say if a party's own guidelines were violated and the law looks at them, we cannot turn around and say that INEC's own guidelines should be disregarded by INEC.
Absolutely.
You know, the referee shouldn't change the rules
That's a
in the
very
middle
good
of the
point.
game.
We've got about 30 seconds before we have to go. It's been fascinating talking with you. But just very quickly, a challenge now, very likely, because they've said they're going to court. There is a timeline for when a challenge must be lodged. But is there also a timeline for when a court must make a judgment?
Yes. So what has happened is because a lot of litigations went for so long that sometimes someone would get victory 3 years after his tenure and end up serving for only 1 year. There was a constitutional amendment to limit the time that these cases could be heard. Now, that has had two effects. One is that it kicks the citizens and their cases back to the end of the line and prioritizes political actors over, ordinary citizens in the quest for justice, which is an unfair outcome. But the other unfair outcome is that certain courts and judges have said, time ran out, so we're just ending this now. So it has its pluses and its negatives.
Right. Okay. I want to thank you very much indeed. Really very enlightening talking with you. Emmanuel Ogebe is an international human rights lawyer and an expert on Nigerian election law. And I can see why you're an expert.
Hey, you're too kind. Thanks, Charles. Adesuwa, you guys are doing a great
Thank you very
job.
much indeed.